Is going gluten-free just part of a fad diet, or can it be a key piece to your health if you're struggling with low thyroid symptoms? In my experience, it can be an important aspect to your healing journey, but there's a few things you'll want to be aware of before you jump into the deep end. So in today's video, we're going to go over 7 things you need to know when going gluten-free to help you feel your best and also maximize any efforts that you're putting into your nutritional changes. And as always, if you like these kind of videos, give this a thumbs up and also subscribe to the channel and ring the bell. I post videos every single Thursday and that'll let you know when new content becomes available. My name is Dr. Bodle and I specialize in helping women with Hashimoto's and low thyroid to lose weight and improve their energy naturally. And whenever we're trying to assess someone's health, we want to make sure that we take a long look at their nutrition. This can include finding foods that work for their body, i.e. don't cause you any problems or symptoms, and foods that don't. One of the foods that fits into this category is anything that contains the protein gluten. For those who don't know, gluten is just a generalized term referring to the proteins found in grains like wheat, barley, and rye. While not a problem for everyone, gluten is higher on our suspect list if we're having reactions to food, and this becomes more likely if we have a history of chronic conditions. So if you're continuing to struggle and feel poorly, and you haven't assessed how your body responds to gluten, it's something that you'll want to keep on your mind. Which brings us to our first tip of the day, which is gluten doesn't always cause digestive symptoms. So this is always a weird one for people because I think we all would think that if we were having a problem with any kind of food, we would expect it to show up as digestive symptoms, but that's not always the case. While gluten can definitely cause those classic digestive symptoms, things like bloating, reflux, digestive cramping, and changes in bowel movements, whether it be constipation or diarrhea, most of the response to gluten is immune mediated, meaning that the inflammatory reaction can go anywhere in the body. Usually when we have an increase in inflammation, it tends to point out the weak areas in our physiology. So if you have a history of headaches or skin reactions or changes in cognition, we may see those things flare up when you consume gluten. Additionally, symptoms like joint and muscle pain, fatigue, or a rapid increase in weight could also all be related to a negative reaction to food. So if you've been having any of these symptoms with regularity and they seem more likely to occur within a few hours after eating, you'll want to consider that your food and the symptoms you're experiencing are likely linked. From there, you'll want to assess if gluten is part of the problem. Tip number 2 is that reactions to gluten or gluten sensitivity is going to be most problematic for people with Hashimoto's. Remember, hypothyroidism is just an overarching term that tells us our production of thyroid hormone is low, but it doesn't tell us why. The most common cause of hypothyroidism in countries that have enough iodine in their food system is Hashimoto's, which is an autoimmune condition that attacks our thyroid gland and eventually leads to that decrease in thyroid hormone production. If you want more information on the differences and commonalities between hypothyroidism and Hashimoto's, I'll link for you my video on the topic in the cards above. But the main thing that we need to know for today is the fact that Hashimoto's is an autoimmune condition, and therefore that increases the likelihood that our immune system is going to be sensitive to things in our environment. This can of course include food proteins, and when it comes to gluten, it presents some unique problems for our body. When our digestion and our immune system are at their best, they're breaking food down into little tiny component parts. That way our immune system can easily assess what it's looking at and determine whether it's something that it wants to absorb into the body or whether it should be rejected. Gluten, however, is a large and complex protein that can be hard for the body to break down. And millions of years of evolution has taught the immune system that if we see something that is large and complex, it's more likely to be a protein associated with a bacteria or virus that's trying to cause an infection. Rather than risk that infection, the immune system tends to play it safe, and when it sees these kinds of complex proteins, it will increase immune system activity to fight off the potential threat. The problem here for people with Hashimoto's is that any increase in immune system activity can increase the likelihood that their thyroid gland is being damaged. Not to mention the fact that for some people, small amounts of gluten can be responded to with a magnified immune response. So even though the quantity of the food that you're taking in is small, the reaction is large, and that can cause a whole host of symptoms. So be aware that if you have Hashimoto's or if you have positive thyroid antibodies on labs, it can make you more sensitive to gluten. And if you chronically expose yourself to these kinds of triggers, it can prevent you from healing and also decrease the effectiveness of your medication. Tip number 3 is that foods with gluten can be problematic for anyone with hypothyroidism, even for people without Hashimoto's, because of the foods that gluten is typically found in. As we said, gluten comes from the grains wheat, barley, and rye, and those usually end up in things like breads, pastries, cookies, cakes, and beer. And even if you don't have an immune reaction to gluten, like someone with Hashimoto's, people with hypothyroidism have a decrease in their metabolism, and that typically leads to a decrease in their ability to process carbohydrates. All of the foods I just listed are naturally high in carbohydrates because of the grain content, and many of them have additional added sugar. When our thyroid function goes downhill, it's common to see changes in the way the hormone insulin works as well, which helps us to respond to dietary carbohydrates. If we can't efficiently move glucose from the bloodstream into our cells to be burned for energy, it can lead to inflammation and having the excess glucose be stored as fat. A few key ways to know that you're not tolerating carbohydrates is you'll feel tired and sleepy within 30 minutes of eating, you'll have difficulty going to sleep at night, and it may be much harder for you to lose weight than it was a few years ago. But I hope you've been enjoying the tips so far, and before we move on to the second half of the video, let me know in the comments below if you've removed gluten from your diet in the past and how did it make you feel? Were you able to sustain that, or was it something that you struggled with? I'm looking forward to hearing your responses. Tip number 4 is that gluten might not be the only food you're reacting to. Quite simply, if we're eating something that our body doesn't like, it can create an inflammatory environment that can make it more difficult for us to process other challenging foods. Injury leads to sensitivity, and if gluten is continuing to injure our gut, it can make us more sensitive to other food compounds. Think of it like an injury to a joint. Sure, most of the time you might be able to go for a jog and have it be no problem. But if you've sprained your ankle, that ankle is going to be more sensitive, and the increased load or demand can cause symptoms to flare up. Same goes for our digestive tract. So if you've eliminated gluten and noticed improvements, but are continuing to have symptoms, you may want to look at other common food allergens, which include things like dairy products, other non-gluten containing grains, and soy, just to name a few. Tip number 5 is that mostly gluten-free really isn't gluten-free, especially when you're just getting started with your nutritional changes. Hopefully, something that you've gathered from the video so far is that reactions to gluten can be systemic, and for some people, it can last a few hours, and for others, it can last a few days. Because of this, the problem with gluten typically isn't the quantity of gluten that we're eating. Instead, it's the frequency of exposure. So that attitude of saying things like, oh, I'll just have a little bit, or maybe just one bite, really needs to be thrown out the window. And to accurately assess how your body does without gluten, you need to be diligent about avoiding it for an extended period of time. I always think a great recommendation when it comes to food changes is doing at least 30 days. But if you're someone who's sensitive to gluten and haven't tested it in the past, then I think 2 weeks is enough to notice changes. Now I know what you must be saying, Dr. Brad, why bother with this silly removing gluten from my diet? Why don't I just get a test for it? Which brings us to our 6th tip, which is testing for gluten isn't all that great. Now I've made a whole video on food testing and why I'm not a huge fan of it, and I'll also link that for you in the cards above. But when it comes to gluten, as we said before, gluten is just a generalized term for many different proteins. So if we're going to test for a response to that, we have to be clear about what we're actually testing for. Typically, people are only checked for one kind of immune response to one of the more common proteins in gluten. And if that test comes back negative, they're usually told that they have no problem with eating gluten and they can continue to do so. The problem here is obviously that what if you have a different type of immune response to a different kind of protein? Not to mention the fact that food testing is still in its infancy, and if you look at any food testing manufacturer, they will tell you that there's a lot of holes in the science, and the best way to determine whether you react to a food or not is still through doing an elimination process. So while I totally agree that it would be super convenient to be able to get a test and have it give us a customizable diet of what we should and shouldn't eat, we're not there yet. And our reaction to gluten can be much more complex than what we see on the labs. Our last tip tip number 7 is how strict you need to be in avoiding gluten is going to depend on you, both your body's response to it and your personal preferences. Although I wish I could give you a firm answer like you can have this much gluten every week or every month, it really doesn't work that way, and this is why it's so important to learn how your body works and experiment with different kinds of approaches. I know not everyone likes the term elimination, but this is where that comes back into play. We should at least assess how we feel without the food and when we bring it back into our diet. Both elimination and reintroduction can provide us with valuable information. Again, I think removing gluten or any other suspicious food for 30 days is a great way to go about it. Once the 30 days are up, you can reintroduce the food by eating it multiple times over a 2 to 3 day period to see how you feel. Once you better understand the response, then the ball is in your court to make your own decisions for your health and your life. I have some patients who think it's just not worth it to eat gluten because it makes them feel so terrible. Others, if they know they're doing a good job with their health in general, feel as though they can have a small amount on special occasions and it's not too much of a problem. Either way, I want you to make a decision that best maximizes your happiness and your fulfillment in life, and that will come down to what your priorities are. But the only way you can do that is by educating yourself on how your body works, and that is going to require some testing and some investigation. But that's all the tips for today. If you have any questions, leave them for me in the comments box below or reach out on social media either through Instagram or Facebook. Also, if you want to learn more about how you and I can work together and I can help you with some of your thyroid symptoms, send me an email at contact@seattlethyroidhelp.com and we can get you set up for a free consultation. Additionally, if you've been using a low-carb or ketogenic diet to help out with your thyroid symptoms, grab my free download at the link in the description box below, which is Electrolytes for Hashimoto's and Keto. So many people are using low-carb these days, but they forget about the electrolytes piece. In the download, it'll show you how much you should be taking and in what quantities. That way you can maximize your success. But that's all for today, you guys. Thanks as always for hanging out with me. If you like this video, give it a thumbs up, share it with a friend, and don't forget to subscribe. Hope you guys are having an amazing week. My name is Dr. Brad Bodle, and I'll see you guys next Thursday.